We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph in Mesechet Kesubos. This is Kesubos Daf 46a. On the previous summit, the Gemara had a contradiction within Rabbi Yehuda. The question was, let's say you have a situation of a motzi shemra. The husband says that his wife has committed adultery. It turns out that the husband is lying. So in that situation, the general punishment is he has to pay a fine of 100 sela, and he gets malchus. But the question was whether that applies in a situation where they had relations, or if it even applies in a situation where they did not yet have relations. And again, the husband accused his wife falsely. So it was a contradiction in Rabbi Yehuda in terms of the malchus. In one case, Rabbi Yehuda seemed to say that you only get malchus if the husband had relations and then claimed that the wife was not a basula. And in the other statement of Rabbi Yehuda, it seems like Rabbi Yehuda said that regardless, the husband is going to get malchus whether there was relations or whether there was no relations. And the Gemara in the previous summit gave Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak's answer, and he answered that really you only get real malchus in a situation of bia, in a situation of relations. In a situation where there was no relations, Rabbi Yehuda simply means to say that there's makas mardus, that there's malchus on a derabanan level. And the Gemara now gives another answer. Rapapa says, "My bo'al loke dekatani hasam mamun." What does it mean over there when it says that you're going to get malchus if there was bia? That's not talking about malchus. It's actually talking about the payment. In other words, when it comes to the payment of 100 sela, so there only is the fine if there is an act of bia, if there's an act of relations. Otherwise, there's no fine. But when it comes to the money, actually, regardless, it doesn't matter whether there is bia or not bia. It makes no difference. There is going to be malchus. Rashi over here says, Rapapa Amar Liola Malchus Mamish. Really, we're talking about real Malchus. Umay Boal. In other words, when we say Malchus, we don't mean Malchus Mardus Durabanan. It means real Malchus. But what does it mean that you only get Malchus when you have relations? And Lo Boal Eno Lok. And if there's no relations, there's no Malchus. The Kamer B'Hach Brisa, that Brisa which said that Mammon. That Brisa is not talking about Malchus. It's talking really about the payment. Mammon de Measela Kamar. It's talking about the fact again that the fine only applies when there is bia, but the fine does not apply if there is no bia. And the Gemara continues, V'kari le l'mammon malchus. Do we ever refer to mammon as malchus? Why would the Brisa say the word malchus, but it really means mammon? And the Gemara says, yes, we do find such a thing. V'hatanan, now they changed this to v'hatanya in the Mesoras Hashas. V'hatanya, but we learned in a Brisa. Ha'omer chatzi erki olai. Let's say a person says, half of my value is upon me. Again, the Torah has values for individuals that they can donate to the Beis HaMikdash based on their gender and based on their age. So those are set amounts. But let's say the person says he's going to donate half of that value to the Beis HaMikdash. So nozen chatzi erko. So the Tanna Kama says he has to give half of that value. That's exactly what he has to give. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda says, Loka v'nosen erech shalem. He gets malchus and he has to give the full value. Now, what does that word loka mean? Loka amai. Why should he get malchus over here? He didn't do anything wrong. So rather, what does it mean? Amar Rapapa says, Loka be'erech shalem. The way you read it is, Loka v'nosen. He is loka in the sense that he has to pay the full amount. The word loka over here doesn't actually mean he gets malchus. It means to say that he is afflicted, he is punished, that he has to pay the full amount, even though he said he wanted to give only half of his value. And the Gemara says, my time. Well, what's the reason for that? Why is it the person says chatzi erki olai, now he has to give the full erech? And the Gemara answers, gezera chatzi erko atu erech chatzio. The reason is because if he says chatzi erko, that means half of his value. That would be half of his value. But what if he accidentally switched it around and said erech chatzio, the value of half of himself? Now that would actually mean the full value. V'erech chatzio havale ever shanashama teluyabo. If somebody says, I'm going to give the value of his half, meaning half of himself, that would be the same thing as saying the value of an aver of a limb, that the entire soul depends on that aver. If a person promises the value of an aver, which without that aver the person wouldn't live, that's identical to promising his full value, and therefore that's the same thing in this situation. If a person says erech chatzio, so then he'd have to pay the full amount, and therefore if a person says chatzi erko as well, he has to pay the full amount. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught, V'yanshu oso. Pasuk says again by Motzi Shemra, where it turns out that the husband is lying, it says V'yanshu oso zem mammon. That refers to the fact that he pays the money. He has to pay the fine. V'yisru, and then the Pasuk says V'yisru zem malchus. That's a reference to the fact that he is going to get malchus. And the Gemara now says, B'shlama v'anshu zem mammon. I understand that v'anshu means mammon. D'chsiv, like the pasuk says, v'anshu oso mea kesef v'nosnu lavia nara. It says that he's punished with mea kesef. It clearly says we're talking about money. Ela v'yisru zem malchus menolim. But how do I know that the word v'yisru means malchus? Amar Rabbi Avo, so Rabbi Avo says, Lamadnu Yisru mi Yisru, we learned the word Yisru. It also uses that similar word Yisru by Ben Sora or Mora. The Yisru mi Ben, and then also by Yisru it talks about Ben, again the Ben Sora or Mora. Uben mi Bin, and then the word Ben is compared to the word Bin, which is said by Malchus, V'haya im Bin Hakos HaRasha, and therefore through the connection of those Gezei Rashavas, that's how we understand that the Yisru means Malchus. And the Gemara continues, Azhara l'motzi shemra minolan. Well, where is the warning for motzi shemra? What is the pasuk that acts as the warning in general? When you get Malchus, there is a pasuk that is a warning. And the Gemara says, minolan again, from where is it? Rabbi Lazar says, mi lo selech Rachel. This is the pasuk that Rashi quoted on the previous Amud. Lo selech Rachel means you can't go and you can't say bad about people. In this case, he's defaming his wife and saying that she committed adultery. So that's the pasuk of lo selech Rachel. That's the warning. Rabbi Nassan says, mi v'nishmarta mi kol davar ra. It says you have to stay away from anything that is bad, and we're understanding the word davar ra over here to be like dibur ra, from bad speech. You have to stay away from bad speech. And when it says hishamer is considered a lo saseh. That's what Rashi notes. And the Gemara says, Rebbe Lazar, my time lo amar mehai. So why did Rebbe Lazar, why didn't he say from the pasuk of v'nishmarta mi kol davar ra? And to that the Gemara says, Ahumi boile Rabbi Pinchas ben Yor, because he uses that pasuk for what Rabbi Pinchas ben Yor taught. V'nishmarta mi kol davar ra. It says you have to be careful, stay away from anything that is evil. Mikan amar Rabbi Pinchas ben Yor. From here, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yor says, Al yaharer adam biyom v'yavoli deitoma b'layla. A person should not think impure thoughts during the day, and it will bring the person to impurity at night. That's actually what the pasuk is referring to. It's not referring to this situation of defamation. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Nassan, my time lo amar mehaikra. Okay, so Rabbi Nassan, why doesn't he say from the pasuk of lo selech Rachel? And to that the Gemara says, Ahu azhara lebezdin. That pasuk he uses as a warning for bezdin. Shelo yehei rach lazeh v'kasha lazeh. That when a bezdin, when they hear a court case, so they shouldn't be easy on one of the litigants and more difficult on the other litigant. Rashi over here says rach lazeh v'rachel lashon rach litiyah. That's the lashon of Rachel, like the language of rach, to be easy on one and to be more difficult on the other. And the Gemara continues, Lo amar la'edim bo'u v'ha'iduni. Let's say the husband, he doesn't tell the edim to come and testify on my behalf that she committed adultery. V'hein me'idim oso me'alein, and they come on their own and they testify against her. So in that situation where he didn't bring the edim, says the Gemara, Hu eino loke v'eino nosen me'aslam. He's not going to get malchus, and he doesn't have to pay the 100 slaim. He doesn't have to pay the fine. And then it also says, Hi v'zomamea makdimin lebeis haskila. She and these false witnesses, they're going to get skila in this situation. Again, this is similar to the Gemara we saw previously. It really means to say, as we're about to say, either she's going to get skila if the Edom are telling the truth, or the Edom will get skila if it turns out that they are false witnesses, if they are Edom Zomim, and they get the punishment that they tried to visit upon her. That's what the Gemara asks. Do you think she and the Zomim get skila? That doesn't make sense. Ella rather, ohi o Zomim makdim lebeis haskila. It means either she or the Zomim, they're going to get skila. And the Gemara continues, Taima delo amar lahu. So the reason over here that we're saying that if he doesn't bring the witnesses, he doesn't get the punishments of the malchus and the fine, that's because he didn't tell them to come. Ha amar lahu. But if he said to them that they should come testify on his behalf, afagav delo agrinu, even though he didn't pay them to come, still that's going to be enough for him to be considered, for it to be considered defamation on his part, and he's going to get the punishments of malchus and the fine. And the Gemara notes, la'afuke mid Rabbi Yehuda. That excludes the position of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not enough simply to tell the witnesses to come. He has to hire the witnesses to come in order to be treated as the Motzi Shemra. The Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa. Rabbi Yehuda says, Eino chayiv ad sheyiskor edim. He's not chayiv until he actually hires the edim. And the Gemara says, my time with the Rabbi Yehuda. What is the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? From where does Rabbi Yehuda learn that he has to actually hire the witnesses in this case? Amar Rabbi Avo says, Asya sima. We learn it out from a Gzeira Shava, the word sima. Ksiv hacha v'samla alilos devarim, by Motzi Shemra, it uses the term v'samla. Again, he defames her. Ksiv hasam, and it says over there, it's talking about the pasuk of ribis, lo simun olav neshech. You shouldn't institute ribis in a situation of a loan. Malahalan mamon afkan mamon. Just like by ribis, of course, we're talking about money. So too over here, it has to involve money. He has to hire the witnesses with money. Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, V'chein Tani Rav Yosef Tzidoni Bei Rav Shimon ben Yochai. Similarly, Rav Yosef Tzidoni taught in the yeshiva of Rav Shimon ben Yochai. Asya sima. Again, we learned this out from the Gzeir Shav of sima, the same source that Rabbi Avohu brought. And the Gemara continues by Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah asks the following question: Sachron bekarka mahu. What if he hires them, but he doesn't pay money? Because again, we're learning out sima from a source that involves money. Well, what if he hires them and he pays them in land? Or bepachos mishava pruta ma'or. What if he pays them, but he doesn't pay them an amount that's considered really money? He pays them less than a shava pruta. He pays them less than the value of a pruta. Or even shneim bepruta ma'or. Even let's say he pays them both, but it's a combination. It's just a pruta, so neither one of them gets a full pruta. What would be the halacha in that situation? Those are the questions of Rabbi Yirmiyah. And the Gemara continues by Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi asks the following questions: Hotzi shemra al hanisuin harishonim ma. What if a person is motzi shemra, but not on this marriage? Let's say he married the woman twice. He married her, he divorced her, he remarried her, but then he says in that first marriage you committed adultery. Or al nisuei achiv ma. Or let's say he says he's motzi shemra, he defames her, but not about his marriage. He really is the yavam. He's doing yibum over here, and he talks about the marriage she had with her brother who died. There was adultery committed in that situation. What would be the halacha? Would that also have all of the rules of motzi shemra? And to all of these questions, the Gemara says, Pshot miyachada, you can at least answer one of these questions. The Tani Rabbi Yonah, because Rabbi Yonah taught, Es biti nosati lo ish hazeh. The father says, I gave my daughter over to this man. It's talking about by motzi shemra, that's what it says. Lo zeh v'lo lo yavam. So it means to this man, not to the brother-in-law. Therefore, the halachas of motzi shemra would not apply by a yavam. And the Gemara continues, My Rabbanan u'may Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. What is this machlokas between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? This is the machlokas that was mentioned on the previous summit in terms of whether the parsha of Motzi Shemra is talking about where there was an act of relations, and he says that he found that she was not a basula, or is it talking about even in a situation where he accuses her of adultery, but there was no act of relations between them? And that comes from the following brisa. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, Keitzad Hotzoas Shemra. How exactly, what is the case of Motzi Shemra? Bezdin v'yamar ploni lo matzasi levitcha besulim. Comes to Bezdin, he says, I didn't find that your daughter was a besula. Im yesh edim shezin satachtav. If there are edim that she committed adultery, yesh la ksuba mana. She receives a ksuba of only 100 instead of a ksuba of 200. Now the Gemara interrupts and asks, 1 second. Im yesh edim shezin satachtav yesh la ksuba mana. If there are witnesses that she committed adultery, she gets a ksuba of 100. Baskilahi. What are you talking about over there? She should get skila in such a situation. If there are edim that she committed adultery, forget about the ksuba. She should be receiving the death penalty. And so the Gemara explains, Hachi Kamar, here's what the Brisa really means. If there are witnesses that she committed the adultery, so then she gets skila. Now, if she committed the adultery from earlier, meaning it wasn't really adultery, she committed znus, but it was before they were ever married, but before the eris and before the betrothal, so then she no longer gets the ksuba of 200, she gets the ksuba of 100. Nimtza shemra eno shemra. Now let's say it turns out that he's lying. This defaming of her was not true. So then the punishment is hu loke v'nosein meyasela. He gets malchus and he has to pay the 100 sela, the fine. Bein boal uvein lo boal. Whether there was an act of relations or not, again, that's the opinion of the Rabbanan. There does not have to be an act of bia for him to get malchus and to pay the fine. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Lo nemru devarim halalu elo keshabual. No, this entire parsha was only said when there was an act of bia, when there was an act of relations. Otherwise, the fine does not apply. And again, otherwise the 100 sela, otherwise the fine does not apply, and otherwise the malchus is not going to apply. And the Gemara says, Bishlam el Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. I understand, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who understands that this entire parsha only applies when there was an act of bia. Hainu d'chsiv. That makes sense in the psukim. The psukim indicate that. The pasuk says, Uva eleh v'akrav eleh. For example, it says, I had relations. Elul Rabbanan, mayu v'eleh v'akrav eleh. What exactly does this pasuk mean? Bo'eleh, ekrav eleh. What does it mean? V'akrav eleh. What does that mean? It's not talking about relations, according to them. And so the Gemara answers, Uva eleh ba'alilos v'akrav eleh. It means that he came to her with all of these claims against her, this defamation against her, these tainas against her. That's what the pasuk means. And the Gemara asks along the same lines, B'shlam el Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, I understand, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Hainu dechsiv lo matzasi levitcha besulam. The pasuk says explicitly, I didn't find that your daughter was a besula. El Rabbanan, my lo matzasi levitcha besulam. How did the Rabbanan understand that pasuk? And the Gemara explains, lo matzasi levitcha kashere besulam. It simply means I didn't find for your daughter people who verified that she was indeed a Basula. Rashi over here says, Kashere Basulim Edim Shiyazimu O Yachishu Esela. We didn't find any witnesses who contradicted, who falsified these other witnesses. V'yachshiras bitchel Basula Gemura. And they said that in fact your daughter really is a Basula Gemura. That's what it means to say in the pasuk. It doesn't mean that I didn't find that she was a Basula physically. It's referring to the fact that there were no Edim to back up and to go against the Edim that are saying she was not a Basula. And the Gemara asks along the same lines, Bishlam Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov, I understand, according to Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov, Hainu Dichsiv, that's what the pasuk means, Ve'ela Besulei Biti. He says, here are the Besulim of my daughter. Again, he seems to be showing some kind of physical evidence. Ela l'Rabbanan, my Ve'ela Besulei Biti. But according to the Rabbanan, what does the pasuk mean when it says, these are the Besulim of my daughter? And the Gemara answers along the same lines, Ve'ela Kashere Besulei Biti. These are the witnesses who are going to falsify the other witnesses and verify that my daughter indeed is a Besula. And the Gemara continues, Bishlam al Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov, I understand according to Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov, Hainu Dichsiv, that's what the pasuk says, Ufarsu hasimla, they take the garment and they spread out the garment. So meaning to say, again, physically they are showing there was an act of bia, they are physically demonstrating that she was a Besula. El Rabbanan, but according to the Rabbanan, Mayu Farsu hasimla, what does it mean that they spread out the simla? So Amar Rabbi Avo says, Parsu Masha Samla, what it means to say is, they spread out that which they placed for her Kiditanya. As we learned in a Braiso, Farsu Asimla, Malamed Shaboyin Edim Shalzeh, Edim Shalzeh. What it means to say is that the various witnesses come. Uborin Sadavar Kasim Chadasha. They spread out the matter like a new garment, meaning to say they clarify the matter. It's not talking about an actual simla, it's just talking about a clarification of what exactly happened. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Devarim kechsavan. You have to understand the pasuk exactly like it sounds like, simla mamish. It's talking about an actual garment, and again, according to him, there was an act of bia. There is an actual physical evidence that they are bringing in terms of whether she is a besula. And the Gemara continues, Shalach Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rav Yaakov bar Giyurei Mishmei Rav Yochanan. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rav Yaakov bar Giyurei sent in the name of Rav Yochanan. Afagav Shalom Atzino b'Chol HaTorah Kula Shechilek HaKasav Bein Bia Kedarka LeBia Shelo Kedarka. Even though in the entire Torah we don't see any distinctions between, let's say, having an act of relations in the normal fashion or having it in the abnormal fashion, in the anal fashion, we don't find any distinctions lemakos or leonshim when it comes to getting makos or other punishments. In other words, if it talks about the fact that you committed some kind of a sin, and it talks about bia, it doesn't matter if it's kedarka or shelo kedarka. Aval motzi shemra chilek, but when it comes to motzi shemra, there is a distinction. Eino chayev at sheyivol shelo kedarka. Person is not chayev unless there's an act of bia. That act of bia can even be shelo kedarka. However, v'yotzi shemra kedarka. However, the actual motzi shemra, the defamation has to be that he is accusing her of committing adultery kedarka, of having a normal act of relations. And the Gemara continues, Keman. So this statement over here, who does it follow? When we're talking about this statement saying that it has to be that it's Motzi Shemra Kedarka, who is it following? Ikar Rabbanan. If you're going to say we're following the Rabbanan, Afagav de lo bal, what are you talking about? By Motzi Shemra, there doesn't even have to have been an act of relations. And so over here it's saying, Eino Chayev ad sheyivol shelo Kedarka, v'yotzi Shemra Kedarka, but the Rabbanan would say there doesn't have to be an act of relations between the husband and the wife, and he can simply accuse her of adultery. And Ikar Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and if it's following Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Vav Amud Beis.